Presuppositionalism, commenting Oliphint's refutation of common sense philosophy. In this video, I will read Oliphint's reasons for faith and comment it. By the end, it will become apparent that Oliphint didn't do his homework. The problem can be stated like this. Oliphint tried to undermine or refute the philosophy of common sense by first refuting only one common sensist, namely Thomas Reid. 2. He tried to do this without reading a single page of Reid's work. There are no citations of Reid's work. 3. He tried to do this by only reading a single essay by someone called George Marsden. That means he only got second or third-hand impressions about what Reid proposed in his writings. This Marsden, as Oliphint represented him, was also very bad at his job. The first is a very bad strategy. Reid wasn't the only thinker to elaborate and develop further the philosophy of common sense. An objection to Reid might not affect other thinkers, such as MCCOSH, Hopkins, or Stewart. One might object that common sense principles are not beliefs, where belief is a certain doxastic disposition toward a proposition. This wouldn't present any problems to MCCOSH, Hopkins, or Stewart, since all of them have different accounts of what these principles are. The second is just bad research practice. If there's no language barrier between the researcher and the author he wants to study, there's no reason to go with second-hand opinions. The most probable outcome here is to strawman the author, which it happened in Oliphint's case. The third goes along with the second. You cannot possibly understand a single philosophical system by reading only one essay. An essay might introduce you to the system, it might provide you a synoptic flight over it, and show its most general outlines, but this is not enough to refute or undermine the system. To do that, you must go over details. Secondary literature might be helpful, but those opinions must be tested against the primary literature. We do exactly the same thing with the Bible. We don't simply go with the word of this or that theologian. That said, let's go. Perhaps the best critique of Reidian approach to epistemology can be found not in a critique of epistemology per se, but rather in a critique of an apologetic approach that, it is argued, has its roots deeply embedded into Thomas Reid's common sense philosophy. Well, the first point is that it is a bad omen when common sense philosophy is constantly referenced, piggybacking Thomas Reid. Common sense philosophy isn't Thomas Reid. He started the project, yes, but has no copyrights over it. This signals the person talking about the system doesn't really understand it, theoretically or historically, something that will be very obvious. In this excellent article, The Collapse of American Evangelical Academia, George Marsden attempts to show the partial historical progression in which scholarship has divorced itself from Christianity, beginning in the 18th and continuing into the 19th centuries. One of the key elements in this progression was the adoption of in evangelical apologetics, as well as the consequent failure of Reid's common sense philosophy. Here we go again, Reid's common sense. The primary reason for this failure, according to Marsden, was that it was never able to provide a ground or foundation for its most basic principles. It was never able to account for its understanding of common sense itself. Okay, so where are the arguments for this conclusion? True, we're in the beginning, but you'll see these arguments will never appear. As Marsden follows the historical progression of the middle of the 19th century, he notes the inability of evangelical apologetics to deal with the destructive elements of Darwinism. Marsden's central question, given such an inability, is this: what about this mid-19th century American evangelical apologetic made it particularly vulnerable to onslaughts of the scientific revolution associated with Darwinism? Now, the mid-19th century American evangelical apologetic of which Marsden speaks is that promoted by, among others, Mark Hopkins, Archibald Alexander, Charles Hodge, and B.B. Warfield, all of them great men and scholars. With regard to the approaches of these men, says Marsden, common sense philosophy was the starting point. Okay. Oliphint says this with a hint that it's problematic, but he still needs to show that it is so. But he didn't. An apologetic with its roots in Reid's common sense philosophy means that one would begin and notice the affinity with Plantinga's views on the matter, with the immediate non-inferential beliefs as Reid proposed, such as the existence of the self, the existence of other personal and rational beings, the existence of the material world, the relationship of cause and effect, the continuity of past and present. These are called, by Reid, principles of common sense. Now, about this, the principles of common sense are not the same in all common senses. And as I said before, not all common senses look at these principles even as beliefs. Two examples are the inductive principle, that is, that the future will be similar to the past, and native theism. Reid believed that such a principle was part of our shared common sense. James McCosh, however, didn't think so. Our tendency to believe the future will be like the past comes from experience, thinks McCosh. We see things happening a certain way, we store these things in memory, and we see them repeating in similar ways. Reid and Stewart also believe in acquired theism. Hodge, Fisher, Alexander, Chalmers, Hopkins, Porter, and McCosh believe in native theism. This to say, specific common sense principles are not a defining trait of common sense philosophy, and the common sense based apologetic doesn't need to follow Reid only. And by the way, why is this problematic? Oliphint didn't give any argument to this point. In defending Christianity, those who adopted this philosophy began by attempting to show how the basic truths and principles of Christianity could fit within the already established truths of common sense. Why is this problematic? In other words, they would argue belief in God can fit with other common sense beliefs that we already have. This would be native theism, which we should note is just another way to phrase Plantinga's argument for theistic belief as properly basic. Maybe we're not talking about Plantinga now, so focus on Reid or common sense in general. Without reproducing Martson's penetrating article, we should note carefully his analysis of the failure of the Reidian via Hopkins et al. Approach. As Hodge, following Reid, of course, Reid always, remarked in stating his assumptions, common sense truths were given in the constitution of our nature. Having been so purposely designed, they could be relied on with perfect security. This is because Reid himself argued that it is possible to establish once and for all a universal code of agreed upon common sense principles. Thomas Reid and other common sensists didn't argue for this. No one ever said that there's a universal consent over common sense principles. They even remark that these principles are very late acquisitions, that is, as conscious principles with which to do metaphysics and philosophy in general. Many thinkers even reject them. What they all seem to agree is one thing, the criteria to determine these common sense principles, which is nativity, universality, and necessity. They are native because we are born with them. They are universal because all human functional adults rely on them. They are necessary because no one can really shake them out of their cognitive processes. Really is an important word here. As I said, common sensists recognize that many men, especially those dedicated to metaphysical speculation, reject these principles. However, in practice, in speech and behavior, they show their reliance on them. You can also check this in my article, by the way. Another thing is, in this paragraph, is that Oliphint seems to be missing a crucial distinction between the reality of common sense principles and the scientific formulation of those principles. It is true of the former that they are native, universal, and necessary as long as human beings are human beings. It is not true of the latter that they will be always the same and universally agreed upon. There's some variety of opinion, as I've shown before. Another distinction that can be decaled on this last one is that between principles of common sense as they are in our minds and as they are formulated in a specific system of common sense philosophy. It isn't clear what Oliphint has in mind when he mentions these principles. Is he talking about this or that common sensist hypothesis concerning the correct set of common sense principles, or is he talking about the real thing, the object of inquiry of these thinkers? And it is not the same thing. People know about genes since the end of the 19th century, but their nature wasn't and still isn't completely understood. And it is the same thing with common sense principles. Back to the text. But there are serious problems with Reid's assumption. For example, when Darwinism, here we go again with the Darwinism, came on the scene, one of its most serious challenges was that it could retain its evolutionary principle without recourse to theism. The problem was not so much that Darwinism needed atheism, which would have been easier because more explicit to deal with, but rather that Darwinism needed only agnosticism. In other words, it was not that Darwinism had to contend there is no God but there is design, but only we see design in everything, though we are not sure whether or not God exists, which is far less radical and thus more challenging than blatant atheism. So Darwinism challenged Christian theism's contention of the certainty of God's existence by postulating agnosticism along with a thesis for design. Tragically, those married to Reid's philosophy could only respond by positing that Darwin's position excluded an intelligent designer, which was all too obvious even to need asserting. Yes, it was obvious. But this is wrong. And this is irrelevant. If common sense philosophy has problems, those problems won't be found in the theoretical traits of 19th century Darwinism and generic theism. If Oliphint has a problem with common sense principles, or with the common sense philosophy in general, he can point them directly instead of taking unrelated detours. What then would happen to this defense? Marsden points out, all that Hodge, for example, could do in the face of Darwinism was assert that large parts of the population still believed in an intelligent designer. Well, about this, expectably, Oliphint mentions some irrelevant objection. There's no challenge here to a common sense-based apologetic. What Darwinism, as Oliphint presents it, implies here is evolutionary theism, that God conducted the process of evolution by some vitalistic principle. Where Darwinism doesn't dare to go, a common sense-based apologetic of native theism flavor points to God and argues for that conclusion. And this is a ridiculous conclusion, given the last comment. About this thing concerning Hodge, this is blatantly false. Okay? Does this seem to you the only thing Hodge could do? He speaks about Lamarck, vestiges of creation, Darwin, look, an exposition of Darwin, remarks on the Darwinian theory, where he throws some objections, the atheistic character of the theory, which is a third point. You have a first and a second argument here, a fourth argument down here somewhere, a fourth remark, it is a mere hypothesis. Then in Theories of the Universe, he's going to talk about Darwin again. And somewhere Okay, admitted difficulties in the way of the Darwinian theory. Specific topics, for instance, the sterility of hybrids, geographical distribution. I mean, can you go any deeper? It's just false. This here, this is just false. And what then would happen to this defense when the next generation would show belief in an intelligent designer to be far from universal? And this is also irrelevant, since Oliphint strawman Hodges' arguments. As shown, what Martin pointed out is only one argument among many others. Just one argument. This is false. Most damaging to the philosophy of common sense, therefore, and according to Martin, the fatal blow to Reidianism was demonstrated in the 19th century in the apologetic responses to the introduction of Darwinism, and the fatal blow is summarized by Martin in this way. Common sense could not settle a dispute over what was a matter of common. All systems are problematic in this sense. No system ever settled any disputes. By this criterion of what is a good or bad apologetic, presuppositionalism is also a pile of dirt. It didn't do anything to settle disputes in apologetics. Presuppositionalists might object, saying that the issue is settled and that the problem is due to hard-headed Christians. This would be a horrible objection, since every other Christian could say exactly the same thing about presuppositionalists, namely common sense-based apologists. This happens also outside of apologetics. There's not one single issue not under some sort of disputation. Even between Reformed Protestants, which subscribe the same rule of faith and the same hermeneutical methods, there are problems. Supralapsarists, infralapsarists, Emeraldists, Credo-Baptists, Paedo-Baptists, amillennialists, postmillennialists, premillennialists, and so on. Aside basic arithmetic, geometry, and other basic formal sciences such as classical logic, propositional or quantified, there's always a huge variety of opinion, though some imperfect consensus might appear, like in many things in physics, chemistry, and etc. Common sense philosophy, therefore, when tried in the fire of apologetic methodology, and thus also of epistemology, they are always so dramatic in their writings, failed in its attempt to defend the truth of Christianity in the face of a hostile science. In other words, the problem with a strict Reidian approach to epistemology is that there is no way, no method or mode by which one might be able to determine just what beliefs are common and what beliefs are not. One man's properly basic belief, therefore, could easily be another man's irrationality. How might we address this problem? This is another straw man, and it's false. I've already mentioned the native, universal, and necessary criterion, but there's also a consensus upon the method to go about finding and specifying these principles and relevant data. And you can also check out this in my article.